Hey guys, Jay here. So I think it's fair to say, lots of hype surrounding the new 1528 series of speakers from Arendal, with many of you asking me to review the 1528 bookshelf next after seeing my very positive review of the 1528 tower speakers. Now, most of you that watched that video did share my enthusiasm for the monstrous 1528 towers as it was, but for some of you, you guys didn't like my unfiltered love for the 1528 towers as much, thinking perhaps that I'm overhyping it. But I do stand by everything I said in that video, like everything, including the one pretty large negative and a deal breaker that I emphasized in that video, which was that speaker won't work for most people because it's a really big and tall tower speaker. And because of the front curved baffle, the optimal listening distance is pretty far away. So you would need a pretty large room to begin with and be able to sit at least 2.5 meters away or 4 meters away from the speakers to optimally enjoy these monstrous towers. And this is where the 1528 bookshelf speakers come in. It's still a pretty big and heavy loudspeaker, and quite honestly, almost as thick and chunky as the towers, but it will still fit and work better in most rooms, including my smallest room. Because firstly, with the bookshelf, you only need to sit 1.5 meters away to get the benefit of the curved front baffle that physically time aligns all the drivers, so that the sound from the drivers reaches the listener's ears at the exact same time. And we saw this front baffle design on the towers as well, but it was much taller, hence why you had to sit further away. But outside of that, you can view this basically as the 1528 towers, only with the one 8-inch bass driver. It is still a 3-way speaker, still has that 5-inch carbon graphene mid-range driver that uses similar quality materials as some mid-range drivers I've seen used in really high-end mini monitors like the Charisma Caprice that cost something like $9,000, a mini monitor that's specifically designed for that really natural and sweet sounding mid-range. It still has that lithium magnesium tweeter, which is super unique and you don't really see it much elsewhere. Now, I did express how much I do love the sound of this tweeter on the tower review as well, but especially here on the bookshelf, I prefer it over even the tower's presentation with this tweeter, even though it's the same tweeter. And we'll talk about why that is in the later part of this video. But it is still using that high density fiberboard rather than the medium density fiberboard for the cabinet and the curved front baffle as well, which by the way is a higher end quality material often used in much higher and higher priced speakers out there. For example, it's what Totem uses, which is another high-end speaker company I love. And measuring the Totem Bison Twin Towers last year, I remember finding very little cabinet resonance considering they didn't have any damping material inside the cabinet, presumably due to the rigidity of the HDF material. But I really wasn't joking when I said this speaker is overbuilt like a tank, because the 1528 bookshelf uses thicker HDF than both the Totems and their own 1723 THX series of speakers. The wall panels are about 2 inches thick, compared to the 1723 series and the Totem speakers, which uses about 1 to 1.5 thick HDF panels. And so as expected of such an overbuilt cabinet, no cabinet resonance to note here, both on the impedance graph and the waterfall graph. Now, cabinet isn't the only thing overbuilt, and the little things that go a long way, like the high quality rhodium plated pure copper speaker terminals and the jumpers for the high frequency and the low frequency adjustment, quality parts like polypropylene caps, air coil inductors, and wire wound resistors in the crossover, and even down to the little details like avoiding the use of ferrous metals like steel in the signal path, and even the port where many manufacturers cheap out because people don't really see inside them, has these small cutouts with damping materials in them to target and reduce port noise. It's all exactly the same as it was on the 1528 towers. And even the deep bass extension and the thunderous bass I loved on the towers is almost exactly the same, meaning you're not going to be losing much bass capability by going with the bookshelf. But wait, you must be losing something going from 4 8-inch bass drivers on the towers to just 1 on the bookshelf. And yes, you do lose something, but that isn't bass extension nor the amount of bass you get. Instead, you lose some sensitivity. Although I did measure the 1528 bookshelf speakers to be around 86 dB in sensitivity, Arendal conservatively rates it at 84 dB for the bookshelf, while the towers, thanks to its 4 bass drivers, are more sensitive at 89.5 dB. Now honestly, that's probably the only real deal breaker for some of you, as the towers will be louder in general, but given the same amp will require less power to get loud. Which makes sense since the towers were made for large rooms and thus need to be able to fill that space. So this means, generally speaking, the 1528 bookshelf speakers won't be the better choice in a large space, since even though your bass performance doesn't change as much, and it would not be a problem for them to get loud enough in a large space, you would need to crank up the volume on a much more powerful amp to do so. However, in a small to medium sized room like mine, the 1528 bookshelf speaker is equally as good in the bass as the towers, and I did not need to use the subwoofer at all. Now, even though this graph looks like it's not fully extending down to 20 Hz, that's because it's a quasi-anechoic measurement. In reality, while it may look impressive, you don't necessarily want to see flat down to 20 in a quasi-anechoic measurement, since when a speaker like the 1528 bookshelf with a gradual smooth roll-off is placed inside a room like mine, it easily becomes a full range speaker, giving you thunderous bass down to the 20 Hz range, no problem, since in many rooms, you gain about 6 dB per octave in the low bass regions. I played some bass torture tracks like James Blake, Limit to Your Love, Make Us Stronger, and Bass I Love You. And yes, the bass is absolutely gnarly. Crazy dynamics, great extension, bass punch, just absolute great authority and weight that you really feel with your body. This is definitely a speaker that you feel the bass with your body. But really, you don't even need bass torture tracks to test the bass capability of these loudspeakers. Playing mellow vocal tracks, for example, like Just a Little Lovin' by Shelby, My Favorite Things by Young Sana, and even Eric's Song by Vienna Tang, I could feel the bass, and the music overall sounded full and textured. Now, some people like their bass really fast and clean, like the Borison X series, for example. Now, I would say the 1528 bookshelf speaker is more fuller and more extended than that. It's definitely more about the heft and the weight of the sound of the bass, rather than being the cleanest or the fastest bass out there. But it's also not like sloppy slow like some vintage speakers from back in the day. But definitely the emphasis is the really extended bass with weight and heft to it. And honestly speaking, I prefer this kind of bass presentation because it sounds more natural to me. And that trend of sounding natural continues into the mid-range and treble. This is a pretty accurate linear loudspeaker. It sounds pretty neutral and really well balanced throughout the frequencies, but far from clinical or sterile like some accurate speakers can be. Just like the bass, I thought the mid-range tone coming from this carbon graphene mid-range driver sounded natural and really helped to sell the illusion of placing a real sound source like a real violin or a string instrument inside my room, when in reality it's just sound coming from a pair of stereo speakers. I think there's two main things that make this accurate speaker also sound very natural. Okay, so we know that the bookshelf has a pretty strong meaty sounding bass, but the mid-range is also meaty sounding, and far from very clean, sterile, and lean kind of sounding mid-range that some people may expect from a very accurate measuring loudspeaker. So meaty bass, meaty mid-range makes for a slightly warm, inviting presentation that you can listen to for a very long period of time without any ear fatigue. It's not overly warm though, just a tad bit. For example, it's less warm than the Sonos Fabric speakers, for example, especially the last gen Soneto series, since those speakers have a mid-bass exaggeration while these Arendals do not. So that's the reason number one for why I think the speakers sound very natural. It has a slightly warm, inviting sound that many people love because it's just easier to digest and listen for long periods of time. Now, number 2 is the exact opposite of number 1. Even though the treble from the tweeter and the mid-range from the mid-range driver sound exceptionally detailed with literally every nuance that you can hear in the music, even the small pauses the singers take for those little breaths could be heard without much effort at all. None of it is bright and shrill or unpleasant to listen to though, because unlike some speakers that boost up high frequencies to make it sound more detailed, which is fair, increasing the treble region is definitely a way to make a speaker sound like that, but the Arendal 1528 do it in a more advanced way. By keeping the high frequencies nice and linear and not boosted, but rather making sure there's very little drop off while keeping the same tone at various different angles to the listener. And you can see this on the off-axis measurements. This not only means that you will have a large sweet spot, meaning you will maintain the same kind of sound quality even if you do not sit dab center between the two loudspeakers, but it also means that you will hear every detail in the music because sound coming to your listening position from every angle will be just as good as the direct sound coming from the speakers to the listener. This is possible because of the permanent acoustic lens you have been seeing sitting in front of the mid-range driver. But you see, this acoustic lens is also in front of the tweeter. These acoustic lenses help the off-axis response, but also the tweeter has this elliptical waveguide as well that helps it further to improve dispersion and off-axis performance. Because the tweeter plays higher frequencies, and at higher frequencies, the dispersion narrows dramatically. And that's why you see the high frequencies fall like a cliff on some speakers when measured off-axis. But because of the acoustic lens and the waveguide on the speaker, the Arendals do not suffer from that. And presumably, due to all this, you hear every detail in the music in a very balanced way, without the artificially jacked up high frequencies. And that leads to no harshness in not just well-recorded music like Fast Car by Tracy Chapman or Layla by Eric Clapton, but also lends itself to being one of the most forgiving, accurate speakers I've heard. With even less well-recorded music pieces like Dream On by Aerosmith or Vienna by Billy Joel, these are recordings I enjoy and love, but can't quite crank up on a lot of loudspeakers, as it will most likely rip my head off with the treble harshness and or indistinct imaging and instrumental separation. But with the Arendals, deep, warm bass presence and its off-axis response aiding in that imaging precision, I was able to play these tracks and actually enjoy them. Heck, even many of the modern recordings sounded excellent. From rap that's seen as sinful and not real music by many audiophiles, to even Taylor Swift's albums. And okay, you can shame me all you want, but removing all the bias, there's no denying that Taylor's albums are very good quality. Presumably due to the large budget they have and the many excellent mixing and mastering engineers involved, but Fortnite on these speakers? The very excellent off-axis and the front curved baffle design has other implications, like it's also going to improve your imaging focus, meaning you'll be able to depict the location of the singers and instruments within the music you are listening to very easily. You know, things like piano behind the singer off to the right and the drum just behind the singer off to the left by 3 feet. And honestly, when properly set up, even create a holographic imagery that is scary, that when used with virtual reality glasses like the X-Real can be quite the freaky experience of going to a real concert. We live in a different world. And this is not an excuse, but this is exactly why I prefer to be a hermit. Now, jokes aside, this type of imaging focus is possible due to the off-axis performance explained earlier. That makes it easier to create a realistic imagery by keeping all the sound coming to the listener almost exactly the same. But also, the curved front baffle that ensures all the drivers are time aligned to reach the listener all at the same time. And talking about that, the Arendals went one step further with this really cool custom fascia here that is one solid piece of machined aluminum that, as you can see, holds the tweeter and the mid-range driver as well, which helps with rigidity, but also helps to keep the tweeter and the mid-range driver as close as possible to each other for a coherent acoustic center. This helps to really blend the tweeter and the mid-range driver seamlessly to improve phase coherency, which also helps to improve things like imaging, sound staging, separation of the instruments, and so on. An example of this is designs like KEF LS50 Meta, what we call a dual concentric or a coaxial speaker, which aims to keep the acoustic center as close as possible by using a tweeter in the center of the midwoofer. Okay, so let's talk soundstage. Imaging is like the placement of the instruments and the vocals. Soundstage is like how deep and wide it sounds to create this illusion of space. And the 1528 bookshelf speaker is not the deepest or the widest soundstage I've heard on a speaker, but it is the most realistic one. Like if I'm hearing a recording done in a church, the speaker creates a good illusion of being in a church instead of exaggerating it to make it sound like it was recorded in a massive hall. And that was pretty consistent across many music pieces I threw at this speaker, from Dire Straits' Brother in Arms album to even live recordings like Ode to Boy by Yazoo. I didn't feel like the speakers were attempting to create a bigger than life soundstage like some horn speakers do, but instead it felt like it was accurately reproducing the soundstage within the recording. So some live recordings did sound larger and more spacious than normal recordings, but in both scenarios, I felt like I was in the space it was recorded in, no more, no less. But of course, I was never there for any of these recordings. So I threw in the pre-mix recording from the recording session I was at for Soundstage, which was recorded in a church. And by now, the acoustics of the church is like engraved in me because I was there for a very long time, and setting up the mics really means we have to pay attention to the acoustics of the church. And yep, surely enough, I felt like I was right there back in Mirabel. Okay, but enough of the positives. Let's talk about some things that's less than perfect on these speakers. For one, these speakers' size is a positive, but also a negative, especially when looking for a compatible speaker stands. Now, this one here is a prototype by Arendal, and as far as I know, they are planning to release it sometime this year, but I don't have any info or, on pricing or exactly when they might become available. But for the time being, I'll link to some stands that will work with these speakers in the description below. And talking about speaker stands, it's also important to get the right height so you are vertically aligned to the speakers. Now, these speakers have a pretty darn good vertical off-axis response as well, but for critical listening, I'd say you are winning if your ears are somewhere between the tweeter and the bass driver here. So these prototype speaker stands are just under 23 inches, and from the floor to the tweeter, it's about 41.5 inches. So that should give you an idea on how tall or short your speaker stands need to be depending on your listening height. Another thing is that in terms of sound, I prefer these speakers at a mid to loud volumes, let's say 70 to 80 dB and louder. Playing these speakers at a low volume is a bit of a mixed bag. While you still get the bass giving that warm presence, it doesn't present the extreme dynamics and the heft at the low volume. And the high frequencies are a bit subdued. This is because us as human beings at lower volumes hear things much less linearly. This shows how loud a sound needs to be at each frequency for a person to hear it. As you can see, our ears are much less sensitive to the extreme ends of the low range as well as the high range at lower volumes. So this means speakers that have a jacked up bass and a jacked up highs, commonly called a V-shaped sound, is probably a better choice if you're strictly listening at low volumes. Now, what gets most people is probably the price. At $4,500 USD a pair, the 1528 bookshelves are definitely more than what some people may be willing to pay for a pair of speakers. And I totally get that. But in terms of value proposition, well, I can't think of another loudspeaker that I've had in here that's as big as these with quality materials, attention to detail, and proper engineering backed up by data. And I bet you can't either. Now, don't get me wrong, there are some heavy hitters in this category that I've yet to review or hear in my space that I would love to compare these speakers to in the future. One is the Perlisten S4B at $4,000 a pair. The other is the Bukar's new E50 loudspeakers around a similar price range. But I also look forward to comparing to some other speakers reviewed to absolute death as the best ever at only 2,200 USDs a pair like the KEF R3 Meta. However, one thing the Arendal 1528 bookshelves has over all of these other speakers is the size. None are bigger than these. So you can definitely look forward to some comparisons with many other speakers in the future because I'm going to be buying a pair of these speakers to replace the Alta Audio Elisa speakers that have been a reigning champion in my speaker tier list for several years now. And that's not to say the Alta Elisa suck now, as it's still a very charming speaker, but once again, the Alisas look tiny beside these monstrous bookshelves, as do the PS Audio FR5 speakers I reviewed recently. And as much as the FR5s were amazing speakers with impressive bass for its size, its scale of dynamics and sound is just outclassed by the much larger Arendal 1528 bookshelf speakers. And for those of you out there that's quick to point out that size isn't everything, yes, I agree. But I will remind you, as you've seen, this speaker's quality, attention to detail, and engineering is just as staggering as the physical size of these speakers. So in conclusion, do I wish the price was lower on these speakers? Absolutely. But is it just another speaker expensive just to be expensive? I don't think so. Now, I've tried nearly dang everything that I have in my arsenal on the Arendal 1528 bookshelves to only find that these speakers actually sound pretty good with almost everything, as long as you keep in mind that this speaker does dip below 4 ohms according to my impedance measurements. However, if you look at Arendal's website, and yes, Arendal did correct me on this, that their speakers actually measured less of a dip than my personal measurements. But I did make sure to measure it multiple times, and I still got the same results. Nevertheless, the point still stands. You still have to pay attention to the power requirement on these speakers, as the sensitivity rating also suggests as such. So my recommendation is to have at least 100 watts of power going into a 4 ohm load. So 50 watts at 8 ohms and 100 watts at 4 ohms would still be okay. But if you can get more than that, then you would just gain more headroom on and also just more flexibility in cranking these speakers up. So I would say power requirement, you don't really want to drive these with 2 amplifiers, although it's possible. I did it with my Bruno Coast and it sounded just fine and it cranked up loud enough for me. But of course, something like the Audience from AGD, my monoblocks did sound much better on these speakers than a lot of tube amplifiers I've tried on this speaker. On top of that, if you want something a little bit more kind of micro detailed and you want something a little bit more on the detailed side with a little bit more faster presentation in the bass region, I would go with something like the Burson's new monoblocks, the GT5, with their new GON Fusion core, which provided really extremely tactile kind of feeling, really kind of a little bit more faster in the bass region, a little bit leaner in the mid-range, but also really, really detailed in the top frequency without that harshness, which gave this illusion of having like things floating in my space. So if you like that kind of effect, that might be a good choice with these speakers. Now, if you're a little bit more budget constrained or budget conscious and want something that's a little bit more simple, minimalistic, then an all-in-one like the Cambridge Evo 150 works great with these loudspeakers. Although I did find the high frequency to be less refined than my AGD Audience or the Burson monoblock, those cost heaps amounts more. So this, for the money, I thought was a great option for these speakers. Now, links to all my recommendations will be in the description below, linked for you guys, but also you can check my link tree to see all the recommended speakers and components that's updated real time. So that's it from me. I hope this video was helpful and entertaining, or both. And if you disagree or agree that this is a good speaker for the money, let me know in the comment section as to your reasoning. Because for me, I think this is a extremely good deal, especially with the 60-day in-home trial that Arendal gives. So if you don't like what I said, or you do like what I said and try these speakers, you have the option to return them if my words don't add up. But regardless, let me know what you think in the comment section below. And I hope to see you guys in my next video. Rock on. Until next time.